The Galactic Forum was a place of peace and diplomacy. It was the heart of the galaxy's cooperation, a huge station where representatives from dozens of species gathered to settle differences, make deals, and ensure the galaxy's future was secure. This was where all the powerful civilizations met. The Krell, a species of wise ancient beings with vast knowledge. The Dravik, fierce and determined warriors. And the Thorns, a mysterious race of intellectuals and strategists. But above all, the humans stood out. Humanity had only recently joined the Forum, but their rapid rise to influence had been nothing short of remarkable. The other species watched with both admiration and fear. Humans had a unique quality, something that no other species seemed to possess. They were adaptable. Their minds were quick. And despite their relatively short history in the galaxy, they had quickly proven that they were capable of more than anyone had expected. They had developed technologies that were both innovative and powerful, and their ability to solve complex problems was unmatched. Yet it wasn't just their technology that made humanity stand out. It was the way they solved conflicts, calmly, without aggression, and often with solutions that others would never have thought of. Humans, unlike most species, were not just driven by their own self-interest. They had an unusual respect for fairness and justice, and that was what made them the perfect diplomats. The Forum had never been so peaceful since they arrived. Disputes were settled, trade flourished, new alliances were formed, but suddenly, everything changed. For weeks, the human representatives were missing. At first, no one noticed. The Forum was busy with its usual activities. However, as the days turned into weeks, a strange unease settled over the Forum. The human delegation was nowhere to be found. The seats that once were filled with their ambassadors were empty. No messages came from Earth. No representatives showed up to any meetings. The leaders of the other species began to whisper among themselves. "What happened to them?" asked the Krell ambassador, his long silver tendrils twitching nervously. "They've abandoned us," said the Dravik representative, his voice low and uncertain. "Maybe they've finally grown tired of our petty squabbles." The Thorns were silent, their golden eyes unreadable. But the message was clear. Something was wrong. The galaxy had grown to depend on humanity's wisdom, but without them, chaos was beginning to spread. Rumors surfaced. Some claimed that Earth had been destroyed, wiped out by some mysterious disaster. Others feared that humans had seen something terrible, that made them retreat from galactic politics forever. The truth, however, was far more unsettling. The human fleet was gone, but Earth was not. The Volari, a small and peaceful species known for their diplomatic skills, were the first to send a scout ship to Earth. Their technology was modest compared to others, but they were clever and resourceful. They had been working closely with humans before the mysterious disappearance. It took the Volari 2 months to reach Sol, the human homeworld. What they found when they arrived shocked them to their core. Earth was as it had always been: green fields, blue oceans, towering cities. There was no sign of a disaster, no signs of war. The planet seemed in many ways more alive than it had been when the Volari first visited. But something was different. There were no transmissions from Earth, no communications, no greetings from humans, as there had been in the past. The Volari ship quietly entered Earth's orbit, hoping for a response. But nothing came. The message they sent back to the Forum was simple. Earth is not destroyed. It is just silent. That silence spoke volumes. Back in the Forum, the other species were beginning to panic. Without humans, the peace that had flourished seemed fragile. Without the steadying hand of human diplomacy, tensions began to rise. The Dravik began making threats again, their war fleets preparing for action. The Krell, ever watchful, feared the worst. And the Thorns, who had always been the most intellectual of the species, now found themselves at a loss. Their strategies, once built on the assumption that humans would always be there to help, began to crumble. Then the unthinkable happened. A single human ship appeared in the Forum space. It wasn't a massive warship. It wasn't an imposing fleet. It was a small, sleek vessel unarmed with the words ambassadorial vessel painted across the side. The ship docked at the forum's central hub, and from it emerged the human. Ambassador, an older man named Marcus Grayson. He was dressed simply with no fanfare. His calm demeanor and weathered face made him seem almost out of place in the grand, glittering halls of the forum. He stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. The room fell silent. "You wanted to know why we left?" Grayson said, his voice steady and measured. "I'll tell you, you all asked us to leave." The leaders of the forum looked at him in confusion. What did he mean? Grayson continued, "For years, we've watched you play games of power. We've watched you manipulate, deceive, and destroy. We watched you use the forum as a tool to keep the balance of power in your favor. But we knew that balance wasn't fair. You allowed it to break and then fixed it with force, with war, with threats. We saw the way you treated smaller species, the way you took what you wanted and left others with nothing." His voice grew colder. "So, we made a choice. We walked away because we realized that true peace can't come from the likes of you. It can only come from those who have the strength to stand on their own, who don't need to rely on the whims of others." The silence that followed his words was deafening. The leaders of the forum didn't know what to say. Grayson turned to leave but then paused. "We won't interfere again. But if you want peace, you'll have to find it yourselves." And with that, he walked back into his ship and left. The galaxy, once full of hope, was now filled with uncertainty. Without humanity's guiding hand, the power struggles began to rise again. What would happen to the forum? What would happen to the galaxy? One thing was certain: the humans had made their choice, and it would change everything. The absence of the humans sent shockwaves across the galaxy. The forum, once a place of unity, now felt like a fragile structure on the brink of collapse. The absence of human ambassadors was felt immediately, like a missing puzzle piece in a picture that had once been complete. The species of the galaxy, all of them, began to question everything they had come to rely on. For centuries, the Krell had prided themselves on their wisdom and long lifespan. Their civilization had lasted thousands of years, and they had seen the rise and fall of countless species. Yet, as the weeks went by without word from the humans, even the Krell found themselves uneasy. Their leaders gathered, discussing what had happened. "The humans have always been unpredictable," one of the Krell elders said, his voice deep and reverberating. "But they always had a reason. Their silence, it is unnatural." The Krell were not the only ones to feel the sting of uncertainty. The Dravik, the fierce warriors of the galaxy, were becoming increasingly restless. Their once proud empire had grown accustomed to the peace brought by human intervention. Without them, the Dravik began to see the opportunity to take control. There were whispers of war. "We are the true power in this galaxy," said a young Dravik general, his eyes burning with ambition. "Without the humans holding us back, it is time we take our place at the top." The older Dravik leaders were more cautious, but even they felt the pressure. It was no secret that the Dravik had always respected the humans. They admired the human warriors for their tenacity, their refusal to back down. They had never seen anything like it. But now, with humans gone, the galaxy seemed ripe for war, and the Dravik weren't the only ones thinking about it. The Thorns, the intellectuals of the galaxy, sat in silence as well. They had always preferred the quiet, thoughtful paths of negotiation, diplomacy, and strategy. They had never desired war, but they understood the importance of power. And without the humans to balance the scales, they felt vulnerable. They knew that their quiet and reserved nature was no longer enough. The galaxy's power dynamics were shifting, and they were unsure whether they could keep up. The Valari, a smaller species, had once relied on human assistance for their defense. Without humans, they were now left vulnerable. Their peaceful nature meant they had never been equipped for battle. They had always trusted the Forum to protect them, but now that the Forum was unraveling, they were uncertain what would happen next. They sent out scouts, hoping to discover any trace of human involvement in the situation. What they found, though, only added to the confusion. As the months passed, the galaxy's leaders convened for an emergency summit. The Krell, Dravik, Thorns, and Valari gathered in the grand hall of the forum, hoping for answers. But no one had any answers to give. The humans had not sent any messages. There was no sign of an attack, no sign of disaster, just a quiet, unnerving silence from Earth. The forum's once bustling halls felt eerily empty without the human representatives. Their seats were vacant, their microphones silent. The usual chatter of negotiations and trade agreements was replaced by hushed tones and nervous glances. It was as if the galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for the humans to return to explain their actions. The Valari, ever hopeful, tried to maintain a sense of peace. They continued to push for diplomacy, hoping to ease tensions among the other species. But their efforts were falling on deaf ears. The Krell had always been reluctant to trust other species, and now their fear of the unknown was growing. The Dravik were eager for war, believing that the absence of the humans meant it was time for them to assert their dominance. And the Thorns, too, were beginning to see the cracks in the forum's foundation, unsure of their next steps. It was during this time of uncertainty that the Valari decided to take action. They sent a small, unarmed scout ship to Earth to investigate. It was their only option left. If the humans were still alive, they needed to know. If they were gone, the galaxy would need to prepare for what came next. The Valari ship was small, and its crew was nervous. They had never ventured so far before, but they had no choice. They left the safety of the forum's space and set course for the Sol system, where Earth waited, silent and still. The journey took weeks, but the closer they came to Earth, the more strange things seemed. Communications from the Valari ship became sparse, as if the very act of reaching Earth had unsettled them. When they finally arrived in Earth's orbit, the crew was stunned. Earth appeared exactly as it always had. Lush forests, vast oceans, bustling cities. There were no signs of war, no signs of any major disruption. But there was no signal from Earth either. The planet was completely quiet. The captain of the Valari ship, a woman named Tira, sat in her seat staring at the planet below. "Something is wrong," she muttered to herself. "This silence, it's unnatural." Her crew tried to make contact again, but still no response came. It was as though Earth was completely shut off from the galaxy. They waited for days, scanning for any signs of life or communication, but there was nothing. Tira sighed and stood. "We're going to have to report back. The humans are not here." Back in the forum, the news was met with shock. The Valari report made it clear that Earth was not destroyed, but it was also clear that something had changed. The humans were no longer part of the galaxy's political scene. What had happened? What had caused them to withdraw so suddenly? And perhaps more importantly, why had they not returned? The silence from Earth grew louder as the days stretched on. The tension in the galaxy reached new heights, and whispers of war became more frequent. The Krell were becoming more aggressive in their stance. The Dravik were preparing their fleets. The Thorns were strategizing for what might come next. And the Valari, once peaceful and hopeful, found themselves wondering if the galaxy could ever truly be united again. For the first time in a long time, the galaxy was filled with fear, not from an outside force, but from within. The humans had always been a stabilizing force. Now, with their silence stretching on, no one knew what would happen next. The silence stretched on for months. The galaxy, once a place of cooperation and diplomacy, was now a realm filled with tension, uncertainty, and fear. The forum's power was waning, and the species who once relied on it now saw it as a fragile institution, one that could break apart at any moment. The humans, once the shining example of peace and negotiation, had vanished without a word, leaving everyone to wonder why. It wasn't just the humans' absence that disturbed the galaxy. It was what they had left behind. A sense of emptiness had filled the void they had created. For the first time, the galaxy's power brokers realized that humanity had been the glue that held everything together. The humans had been the ones who could balance the fragile peace, who could speak to every species without the weight of arrogance or fear. Their absence now seemed like a signal, one that could no longer be ignored. As the months turned into a year, the tension grew. The Dravic Empire, once cautious under the watchful eyes of the humans, began to flex its muscles. Their warships patrolled the borders of smaller systems, and whispers of invasion began to circulate. The Dravic had always been warriors, proud and fierce, but without the humans to mediate, they saw an opportunity to expand their influence. The other species began to worry. If the Dravic decided to launch a full-scale campaign of conquest, who could stop them? The Krell, wise as they were, knew that something needed to be done. They called for an emergency summit, hoping that the galaxy's leaders could come together and find a way to restore order. But when the representatives gathered, the problem was clear. Without humanity's steady hand, the galaxy was descending into chaos. "There is no balance," said one of the Krell elders, his voice heavy with the weight of history. "The Forum is no longer the unifying force it once was. The Dravic grow bolder by the day, and the rest of us are left to watch." The Velari, who had once found comfort in human protection, were growing increasingly fearful. Their peaceful nature meant they had no weapons to defend themselves against the larger, more powerful species. The absence of the humans meant they had no one to turn to. Their fragile alliance with the Krell was the only thing keeping them safe, but they knew it wouldn't last forever. "We cannot wait any longer," said Tira, the captain of the Velari scout ship that had visited Earth. She had seen firsthand how the galaxy was changing. "We must take action. If we don't, the Dravic will crush us all." But the Thorns, always calculating and cautious, warned against rushing into conflict. "Patience," one of their leaders said, his voice soft but firm. "We must think carefully. Any rash decision could lead to a war we cannot win." Still, it was clear that something had to be done. The galaxy was on the brink, and all eyes were on the Forum to find a solution. It was at this moment that a message from Earth finally arrived. The transmission was short, direct, and unlike anything the galaxy had ever received before. The message came from the human government, a coalition of leaders who had always been known for their diplomatic approach. It was delivered by a single, human representative, a woman named Elena Frost. She was no stranger to the Forum, having served as Earth's ambassador for years. But this time her message was not one of peace. It was a declaration. The galaxy's leaders gathered in the Forum's great hall, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Elena stood alone before them, her expression calm but resolute. She had been the one to bring the message. She was the one who would tell the galaxy why humanity had walked away. "You have all asked why we left," Elena began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fire. "I'll tell you." There was a moment of silence before she continued. "For years we tried to help. We came to you with solutions, with hope. We helped mediate your conflicts. We prevented wars. But over time, we realized something. You didn't want peace. You wanted control. You wanted to use the Forum to keep the balance of power in your favor, and you didn't care who got hurt along the way. You manipulated smaller species, treated them like pawns in a game, and then called yourselves diplomats." The room was silent, each leader hanging on her words. The Krell, the Dravic, the Thorns, and the Velari, all of them had heard the accusations, but none had ever been spoken so openly. "We saw it," Elena continued, her voice growing firmer. "We saw how you plotted against each other, how you undermined the ones who tried to make a difference. We saw the shadows of corruption that ran through your governments. We saw the way you treated humanity, like a tool to be used when it was convenient. We were your shield, your bargaining chip. But we were more than that. We are more than that." The leaders of the galaxy began to shift uneasily in their seats. The truth of Elena's words was undeniable. The humans had been the ones to prevent full-scale war on several occasions. They had been the ones to stop a galactic collapse, and yet it seemed they had always been seen as little more than a stabilizing force, a tool for the larger, more powerful species. "For years we kept quiet, thinking that peace could be achieved through negotiation," Elena said, her eyes scanning the room. "But we realized that true peace is not something that can be bought or negotiated. It is something that must be earned. And so, we decided to walk away. There was a long pause before she spoke again, and when she did, her words were sharp and final. We are done intervening. The galaxy must stand on its own now. You will have to find your own way forward without us. We will no longer be your shield. We will no longer be your sword. We will no longer be your peacekeepers. The time has come for you to decide who you really are. With that, Elena turned and left the forum, leaving the leaders in stunned silence. Her message was clear. Humanity was done. They had done their part, and now the galaxy would have to fend for itself. The transmission from Earth sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The Krell, the Dravik, the Thorns, and the Valari all found themselves facing the reality of what humanity's departure meant. They were no longer in control, they were no longer protected. The peace they had relied on was fragile, and now it was breaking apart. The galaxy's leaders were left to wonder, what would happen next? Would the Dravik move to conquer, knowing that no one would stop them? Would the Krell, ever the schemers, take advantage of the situation to expand their own influence? Would the Valari, the smallest and most vulnerable, find a way to survive? One thing was certain, the galaxy would never be the same again. The days that followed Elena Frost's message were filled with unease. The galaxy, now without the steady hand of humanity, felt like a ship adrift in an ocean without a captain. The powerful species, once comfortable in their position, now found themselves unsure of their next move. The Dravik, with their war fleets prepared, stood on the edge of conflict, eager to expand their influence. The Krell, ever the schemers, searched for ways to solidify their control without disturbing the fragile peace. The Thorns, calculating and patient, weighed their options, while the Valari, small and vulnerable, clung to the hope of survival. But it wasn't just the powerful species who were changing. The smaller, once ignored species were also starting to stir. They had watched humanity, who had once been a protector, slowly withdraw, leaving behind a galaxy unsure of itself. They saw a chance to rise, to find their own strength in a galaxy that no longer had the safety net humanity had once provided. As the months passed, one message finally came from Earth. A single, unarmed human ship entered the forum space, breaking the long silence. The ship was small, but it carried a weight of importance with it, the kind of weight that even the largest and most powerful warships couldn't carry. This time, there was no ambassador, no speeches, no grand promises, only a warning. The ship docked at the forum's central hub, and aboard it was a man named General Lucas Hale. Unlike the previous representative, Elena Frost, who had spoken with calm authority, General Hale was different. His presence was quiet, yet imposing. His sharp, calculating eyes and military posture sent a ripple of uncertainty through the forum. It was as though this man carried the burden of a decision that could alter the course of history. The galaxy's leaders had gathered again, this time in a tense and expectant silence. The Krell, the Dravik, the Thorns, and the Valari all waited, unsure of what to expect. The last message from Earth had been clear, but the appearance of a human ship now added a layer of mystery. Why were they here? What was the meaning of their return? General Hale stood at the front of the room, his face unreadable. He waited for the quiet to settle before speaking. We were asked why we left. We were asked why we abandoned the forum, he began. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, one that made everyone in the room listen closely. We made it clear before. We left because we saw the truth. You sought peace, but you did not want it. You wanted power, control. You played games while the rest of the galaxy suffered. A hush fell over the forum as the weight of his words settled into the room. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances. No one had expected this kind of directness, this raw honesty. The words stung, but they were true. The Krell, so used to their centuries of influence, shifted uncomfortably. The Dravik, who had always held power through fear and might, clenched their fists. The Thorns, intellectuals who had prided themselves on strategy, found themselves facing the uncomfortable reality that they, too, had been complicit in the games of power that had led to this moment. We don't need to remind you of the deals, Made behind closed doors, General Hale continued, his voice unwavering. The alliances formed for convenience, the smaller species ignored, and the weaker ones crushed. We watched it all. We were complicit in it, and we were wrong. The Thorn's leader, always calm and calculating, spoke up. Are you saying that humanity is now above us? That you can just walk away and leave us to clean up your mess? Hale's eyes flicked to the Thorn leader, his expression hardening. I'm saying that humanity is done cleaning up everyone else's mess. You were given a chance. You were shown the path to peace. But instead, you've chosen to walk a different road. A road that leads to war, to bloodshed. We won't stop. We won't intervene anymore. The Thorn's leader opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to them this way. The Krell and Dravik sat silently, processing the gravity of the moment. They realized what General Hale was saying. They were on their own now. The protection of humanity was no longer there. The peace which had been so carefully maintained was gone. The warning is simple, General Hale said, his voice calm but full of authority. Humanity will no longer be your shield. We will not stop your wars, nor will we fight your battles. If you choose war, you will fight it alone. If you choose peace, you will find the way yourselves. There will be no more negotiations, no more compromises. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick, as each leader absorbed what had just been said. The Thorns, who had once prided themselves on their intellect, were left without an answer. The Krell, who had always considered themselves the most powerful, now found themselves vulnerable. The Dravik, so eager to prove their strength, were left to question whether they could conquer without humanity's influence. And the Valari, who had always looked to others for protection, now found themselves realizing they had to make their own way in a galaxy that was no longer safe. General Hale's gaze swept across the room. You will find your own way forward, he said again. Just remember this. The future of the galaxy is now in your hands, not ours, not humanity's. Your choices will define the next age. Whether that age is one of peace or destruction is entirely up to you. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the galaxy's leaders to ponder the consequences of their actions. The warning had been given. The message had been clear. There was no turning back now. As the human ship departed, the Forum remained in an uneasy silence. The leaders, once so sure of their power, now found themselves questioning everything. The galaxy, once held together by the fragile threads of diplomacy and human intervention, was now on the brink of something unknown. The delicate balance had been shattered. The peace that had lasted so long was crumbling, and the road ahead seemed uncertain. Would the Dravik launch their war? Would the Krell seek to dominate? Would the Thorns turn inward, seeking knowledge over power? And would the Valari find a way to survive in a galaxy without the protection they had once taken for granted? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The galaxy had been changed forever. And the warning from humanity echoed in the minds of every leader, every species. The future was now in their hands. The galaxy had been forever changed. The warning from humanity had echoed across every star system, each leader feeling the weight of their own choices. No longer would they rely on the protection of the human peacekeepers. The Great Forum, once a symbol of unity and cooperation, was now on the brink of collapse. The galaxy had grown used to the humans' calming presence, their ability to mediate disputes and prevent war. But now, without that hand to steady the wheel, chaos began to spread. The Dravik Empire, once a fierce warrior race, saw an opportunity. With humanity gone, there was no one left to stop them. They had long believed that their strength and might were the true measure of power in the galaxy, and now, it seemed like their time had come. Their war fleets, once cautious, now surged forward, gathering in preparation for what they saw as the inevitable conquest of weaker systems. The Krell, with their vast intelligence and ancient wisdom, found themselves on edge. They had always been the quiet power in the galaxy, watching from the sidelines, manipulating events with subtlety. But now, with the galaxy on the brink of war, their once perfect plans seemed less certain. The balance of power had shifted, and the Krell were unsure whether they could hold on to their position of influence without the humans' steadying influence. Their leaders convened in secret, plotting their next move. Meanwhile, the Thorns, ever the strategists, were calculating. They were no strangers to war, though they preferred their conflicts fought with words and ideas rather than weapons. But, with the Dravik on the rise and the Krell uncertain, they knew they had to act. They began to rally other species, trying to form new alliances in the face of the growing conflict. But the Thorns' cautious nature and reluctance to take action quickly meant they were always a step behind. The Velari, once the most peaceful of the galaxy species, were now left to fend for themselves. They had relied on the protection of the humans, trusting that the Forum would always be there to safeguard them. But now, without that protection, they found themselves vulnerable. The Velari leadership gathered to discuss their options. Should they join one of the larger empires for protection? Should they fight? Or should they try to form their own alliance of smaller species, those who were also feeling the weight of humanity's absence? But in the midst of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. The smaller species, the ones that had been pushed aside for so long, began to rise. In the shadow of the larger empires, a new alliance formed. The Velari, along with the Dralik. The Icor and the Ninarians, all of whom had once been overlooked and forgotten, found strength in unity. They shared a common bond, the desire for independence, for self-determination. They no longer trusted the larger species who had used them for their own gain, and now they were ready to fight for their survival. The leaders of this new alliance met in secret, far from the eyes of the Forum. They knew that the galaxy was in turmoil, and they saw this as their chance to change the rules of the game. They could no longer rely on the Forum, and they could no longer trust the larger powers. But together, they could carve out their own future. Their first move was subtle, a quiet uprising in one of the smaller systems that had long been under Dravik control. It was a test, a sign that the smaller species were no longer willing to sit idly by. The Dravik, who had expected no resistance, were caught off guard. The smaller species fought back with a strength and determination that the larger empires had underestimated. The Dravik were forced to retreat, humiliated and surprised. It was the first victory for the alliance of smaller species, and it sent a shockwave through the galaxy. The Dravik were not invincible, the Krell were not all-powerful, and the Thorns, though clever and strategic, were not beyond defeat. The galaxy watched as these smaller species, once overlooked and forgotten, began to rise. The Dravik Empire, once seen as the strongest military force in the galaxy, now faced challenges on multiple fronts. The Krell, long the manipulators of galactic politics, found their influence waning. The Thorns, always calculating and cautious, struggled to maintain their alliances. The Velari, who had once feared the larger powers, now found themselves leading a movement. Their peaceful nature had been their greatest strength and their greatest weakness, but now, with the humans gone, the Velari realized something important. They didn't need to rely on anyone else to survive. They had the strength to stand on their own. But even as the smaller species began to rise, the larger powers were not finished. The Dravik Empire, burned by their loss in the first skirmish, regrouped and came back stronger than ever. Their fleets, once hesitant, now roared across, the stars determined to reclaim their position. The Krell, ever the strategists, sought to regain their influence through cunning and manipulation, using their vast knowledge of the galaxy to outmaneuver their rivals. And the Thorns, though hesitant at first, began to consolidate power, knowing that their only chance for survival was to adapt quickly to the new realities of the galaxy. The war was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The galaxy was now a place of shifting alliances and growing tensions. The small species had risen, but their future was uncertain. The larger empires, though challenged, were far from defeated. The balance of power had been upset and no one knew how it would end. What had started as a peaceful galaxy, held together by the human steady influence, had now become a battleground. The question was no longer whether the galaxy could find peace, but whether it could survive the storms of war that were coming. In the midst of this chaos, the humans watched from the sidelines. They had made their choice. They would not interfere. But they were not blind to what was happening. The message they had given had been clear. The galaxy had to stand on its own. Now, as the smaller species rose, they could only watch and wonder. Would the galaxy rise to the challenge, or would it fall into the same cycle of war and destruction it had known for centuries? Only time would tell. The galaxy had been through an era of silence and uncertainty, a time when the peace they had come to rely on seemed shattered beyond repair. The rise of the smaller species had shaken the foundations of the old order, and now, as tensions grew, it was clear that the future of the galaxy was no longer in the hands of those who had always held power. The Dravik, the Krell, and the Thorns, once the dominant forces, now found themselves facing the unexpected strength of the Valari, the Icor, the Dralik, and the Ninarians. The galaxy was on the brink of a new chapter. War, peace, alliances, and betrayals. The future was uncertain, and the choices made in the coming months would shape the galaxy for centuries to come. In the midst of this shifting landscape, a council was convened. It wasn't a formal summit in the grand halls of the Forum, but a quiet meeting held in a remote location, far from the prying eyes of the larger empires. The leaders of the smaller species, once ignored and underestimated, gathered together to discuss their future. The Valari, who had once been the most peaceful and vulnerable of them all, now stood as the leaders of this new alliance. They had become the voice of the rising factions, the ones who sought to redefine what it meant to survive in this new galaxy. Among them was Tira, the captain of the Valari scout ship, who had witnessed the transformation of her people from passive observers to active players in galactic politics. She had been the one to first suggest that the smaller species unite, to find strength in their numbers. Now, as the meeting took place, she stood as one of the key voices, her calm and steady demeanor commanding respect. "We cannot allow ourselves to become like the ones who have oppressed us for so long," Tira said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "The galaxy has been held hostage by power for too long. It is time for a new path, one that is built on cooperation, mutual respect, and fairness. If we are to survive, we must hold to these principles." The leaders of the Dralik, Icor, and Ninarians all nodded in agreement. They had long known the harsh realities of galactic politics, and many had suffered under the yoke of the larger empires. The Dralik, once a warlike race, had been pushed into the shadows by the Dravik. The Icor, small but clever, had been ignored by all but the Thorns. And the Ninarians, a peaceful species, had been driven from their homes by the ever-expanding borders of the Krell. Now, united, they saw a new hope. "We have been given a chance," said Rico, the leader of the Dralik, his voice deep and commanding. "A chance to rewrite the rules of this galaxy, but we must act quickly. The larger empires are not idle. They will strike at us if we give them the chance." "I agree," said Ilara, the Ninarian leader, her eyes sharp and thoughtful. "We have been underestimated for too long. Now, it is our time to take control of our own future." The discussion continued late into the night, each species bringing their unique perspectives to the table. Despite their differences, they shared a common goal: survival. They knew that if they didn't act, the Dravik would continue to expand, the Krell would continue to manipulate, and the Thorns would continue to play their games of power. But together they could create something different, a galaxy where they were no longer pawns but players. Meanwhile, the larger empires were not standing still. The Dravik Empire, humiliated by their defeat in the first skirmish, began to regroup. Their fleets, once scattered, were now united in purpose. The Dravik believed they could still impose their will on the galaxy, and they were willing to fight to prove it. The Krell, ever the manipulators, sought to regain their influence. Their agents infiltrated the smaller species, sowing seeds of doubt, hoping to divide the alliance before it could truly take form. The Krell knew that a united front of smaller species could be a powerful force, and they were determined to stop it before it gained too much strength. The Thorns, though hesitant at first, were also preparing for the coming storm. Their strategists had spent years crafting plans for such a moment. They knew that in times of chaos, the most powerful weapons were knowledge and foresight. They were already working on ways to influence the growing alliance of smaller species, to use their intellect and resources to turn the tide in their favor. The war that followed was not one of large-scale battles and overwhelming destruction. It was a war of small victories, of strategic maneuvers and clever alliances. The smaller species, united for the first time, were able to hold their ground. They didn't have the massive fleets of the Dravik, the political influence of the Krell, or the vast knowledge of the Thorns, but they had something more powerful: unity. The first major victory came in the border systems, where the Dravik had hoped to expand their territory. The alliance of smaller species, using their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to work together, launched a surprise attack. It wasn't a battle of overwhelming firepower, but of tactical brilliance. The Dravik were forced to retreat, their arrogance shattered. It was a sign to the galaxy. The smaller species were not to be underestimated. Over the following months, the alliance grew stronger. New species joined, each one bringing its unique strengths to the table. The Valari, once the most vulnerable, had become the symbol of hope. They had shown the galaxy that even the smallest and most peaceful species could rise to power, if only they stood together. The larger empires, meanwhile, found themselves caught off guard. The Dravik Empire, despite their best efforts, were unable to break the alliance. The Krell, once so confident in their manipulations, found themselves unable to divide the smaller species. The Thorns, though brilliant strategists, were unable to predict the unpredictable unity of the smaller species. In the end, the war did not end with a single decisive battle. Instead, it ended with the realization that the galaxy had changed. The smaller species, once overlooked and dismissed, had proven their strength. They had not only survived, they had thrived. The galaxy, once dominated by the Dravik, the Krell, and the Thorns, was now a place where unity and cooperation were possible. The old powers had been forced to accept a new reality. The galaxy was no longer their domain. The future was now in the hands of the many, not the few. And so, a new dawn began. The humans, watching from the sidelines, saw the rise of a new order. They had made their choice to step back, to allow the galaxy to find its own way. And though they would no longer intervene, they knew one thing: the galaxy had proven that it could stand on its own. Whether it would remain united or fall into new divisions was a question for the future, but for now there was hope. The future was theirs to shape. This concludes the story. Would you like any changes or additions to the conclusion? Or is there anything specific you would like to explore further?